whether it be, I do a variety of different things, so, it could be about, comics, stuff outside of comics, film, TV, directed some music videos, write comics, draw, anything that characters that you have questions about, be happy to make sure we're talking about the things that you're interested in too. But a lot of you might know me from my work on Kabuki. It's a great series I wrote and drew. And from that, I got offered to start writing Daredevil at Marvel Comics. And when I was first writing Daredevil, Joe Quesada is the guy who hired me. He was also the artist of the book. He asked me to take over writing after Kevin Smith. And I asked him, is there anything in particular you want me to write since you're drawing it? And he said, write whatever Daredevil story you want. I just ask one thing, and it's that you create a brand new character. And that became the Echo character, Maya Lopez, who was in the Hawkeye series, and I'm told they just finished filming Echo here in Atlanta, and that comes out as a TV show next year. Since then, I've been doing a lot of Neil Gaiman's covers for his series Norse Mythology and American Gods, and a lot of prints for their websites. Some of you might know me from my Jessica Jones covers, and I worked on the Netflix series. I did the opening titles for the Netflix TV show.
Well, you also did the credits for Winter Soldier.
Yeah, if you've seen the film Captain America: The Winter Soldier, I did the main titles for that film. On that one, it comes at the end of the film.
Yeah.
And it's like all those black and white bold shapes that come at the end of the film.
That's you.
Yeah.
Good job.
Yeah, thank you. And for the Netflix Jessica Jones, we got nominated for an Emmy for that one. So, for this comic that we did like 20 years ago, I went to the Emmys. I never would have expected that.
All right. You seem like you want to just answer questions, but we can definitely talk about Daredevil.
Yeah, but if you have anything in your mind that you want to throw out there.
I'm supposed to actually say hello from Kabuki. So, obviously, yeah.
Yeah, Kabuki is Neil Gaiman's vice president of everything Neil Gaiman.
She runs Neil better than Neil. She's an absolute delight, but basically, she's also like a stage manager and roadie for all these bands. She's like a pure rock star. We love her too. Yeah, her and Neil still sending Christmas and birthday cards. It's always a delight.
Yeah, Kat was. I think she's pretty much working for Neil 24/7 now. But for a long time, she was also running the tours of different musicians, including Tori Amos.
Yeah.
And that's when that's how Neil and Tori met. She was running Tori's show and invited Neil to do Tori's show.
She did a few TV stuff, and Conan was on the road after that whole Tonight Show thing. She handled all of it. So if you see anything from Neverwhere, that's all Kat. And
yeah, all those prints that I did for the Neil Gaiman prints, it's all Kat Mythos organizing all that, and then Neverwhere.net, that's the site that she runs to sell
it's a nice plug.
Yeah, exclusive Neil Gaiman related merchandise is all through Neverwhere.net, through Kat Mythos. So shout out to her.
Oh yeah, definitely. So writing Daredevil, because you handled so much, especially when you're relevant and everything like that. And Bendis is here because you guys co-wrote some stuff together too.
Bendis and I co-wrote Daredevil End of Days.
Yeah.
It was an 8-issue series. I guess it was 10 years ago now. But it was really an incredible experience because, first of all, Brian and I have been best friends since 1993, and we've worked on several things together. And more recently, we've done a creator-owned series together called Cover. But we were co-writing Daredevil End of Days, and we asked Bill Sienkiewicz and Klaus Janson to do the art for it, which were heroes of ours when we were growing up, and guys that were working on Daredevil when we were reading it, and very formative influences on us. So it was amazing to put that project together and work with them on that.
I still haven't met Brian at all. So I gotta stop by and saw him.
Well, he's not here anymore, but he was here the last 2 days.
Oh, okay, he's gone. All right, yeah.
He was sitting set up right next to
I know, and I'm in my table, so it's just not
Right.
But one day. But yeah, I guess we can open up the floor for questions. If not, yes? Was there a question? No? Okay. So,
Let's talk about your visual influences, because it's sort of, it's art, but it's also poetry, especially, like how you incorporate like a lot of that. But you didn't actually go to school for art, if I remember correctly.
I got a BFA in graphic design, so when I was in college, that entailed like taking all the design classes and all the fine art classes together. But I knew when I attended college that I had already decided I was going to do comics, and where I went, they didn't have any classes or anything you could major in to do comics at that time. Some schools do have that now, but at the time, so I thought, well, graphic design is kind of taught as a synthesis of an integration of type and image, and I can learn from that as much as I can and apply that into my comic book world. And so it gave me a good sensitivity to type and design, and I was taking a lot of the fine arts classes, and everything I was learning in all of those different classes, I just tried to funnel that into the work I was doing for comics, which became that creator in series I mentioned called Kabuki, which I was publishing the entire time I was in college.
But I mean, even look at those early Kabuki sequentials. I mean, it's still fine art because it reminded me of like this cover stuff. It reminds me of, I mean, you can see Dave McKean, a lot of like, stuff like that in there.
For me, it was a great opportunity because I was gleaning information from all of these classes and fine arts and design. I didn't go to a specialized art school, so I went to a university where I had to take a lot of other classes too, and foreign languages and science classes and everything else, which I think was good for me because it opened my world up to all of these other things, and I was able to kind of like, all of that enriched my work, and like my comic book work has kind of been like my playground or my laboratory to integrate whatever I'm personally interested in and work that out, but also kind of integrate all the stuff that that I'm figuring out and meld that into the comic book at the same time.
Do you have a preference for writing over illustrating?
Well, when I started doing Kabuki, I only intended to write it. Yeah, I thought of myself primarily as a writer, and I was searching for an artist to do the artwork for it. I met Brian Bendis in Chicago in 1993. We were both at a small indie publisher called Kabuki. And at the time, he was trying to make a living as a penciler. And when I first met Bendis, he got me, he showed me one of his creator in comics that he was writing and drawing. It was this creator in comics book called Fire. It was kind of like a espionage, but he had a certain kind of inking for it, and like it was made on like a photocopy, so I took like a Sharpie and I was drawing on top of it. I was like, maybe you should do like the inking more like this. And he liked it, his inker. So we worked together as a penciler inker team like in the early 90s, Bendis and I. And Bendis was going to be the original artist on the movie. I was just writing the story, and then Bendis was going to be it. So I like early 1993, Brian Michael Bendis wrote the art.
It's just so fascinating to think about that money right now.
You know what? This reminds me of something that I'll say to other people who are, if you're interested in writing or drawing something, the way I kind of trick myself into doing it is, just biting off a small story. And so many people come up to you and they tell you about this project they're going to do. That's this giant world-building story. That's this multi-volume story. And it's so big, and they haven't started yet, and because it's so large, you kind of know they're never going to do it, because it's so big. What I tell people is, just give yourself like a 4-page story, or a 2-page story, or a 6-page story, or an 8-page story, because it's small enough that you know that you can complete it, but it also teaches you the discipline to be economical with your words and images, because you know you have a finite amount of real estate to fit it into it. Yeah. So that was kind of how I tricked myself into doing the art for Kabuki. I thought, I've written a story, and Bendis is like the real artist on it. He's going to really do it. But an anthology book, Caliber Comics had an anthology called Negative Burn back then, and they said, we would like you to do an 8-page story for us, and write it and draw it. So I thought, okay, 8 pages, I can handle it. I'll do an 8-page Kabuki story because that'll help me just sort of figure it out for the real artist. It'll be like sort of like a little, little Bible or example for the real artist. I can decide what the logo looks like and the costumes and the vibe and the tone of the series will look like in these 8 pages, and hand that off to the real artist as an example, right? So I did this little 8-page story, and it was kind of fun. Knowing it's only 8 pages, you go, oh, it's going to be done within this certain amount of days, you know? And it was published in this anthology, and then they asked me for another 8 pages in another anthology, and I did that again, and then each one was sort of like a very tight little scene. So like having only 8 pages, it really taught me how to like get into the scene, get out of the scene, everything you have in the pages, and you only have 8. You can't keep just giving yourself more pages. So you have to really be decisive about what you leave out and what you include, which I think is really good training for yourself as a writer and an artist, especially in comics, because it really forces you to understand like the shape and size and amount of panels and how they're used, and the right amount of information you should be delivering for each page, and also the right ratio of like words to image. You know, you don't want to overwhelm people with too much text and so on. So that was a really good training for me. So I ended up doing 4 different 8-page sequences of Kabuki in 4 different anthology books. And then the publisher said like, hey, you know, when's this Kabuki book gonna come out that you're talking about? You know, I'm like, well, Brian's gonna draw it. They said, well, you know, you've got 4 8-page scenes, put them all together, and it's a 32-page comic, right?
Yeah.
So I put that, they weren't meant to like be sequential even. They're like 4 separate scenes, but so if you look back at that like early, very first Kabuki one-shot, I was like, we'll just offer this as a one-shot. It'll let people know that this book is, this character is out there, and it'll eventually be, you know, a real series. But each of those 8-page scenes is kind of like independently titled and put together, but they just kind of work. They worked as a, you know, they kind of fleshed out the character. Each one sort of had a slightly different style and a slightly different feel and tone to it, but it kind of worked as a one-shot. And it was Caliber published it, and it was like their best-selling book of like the whole last few years, right? So they're like, hey, this, you know, when are you doing the next one? You know, I still thought like this one shot would be a good example for the real artist, but I kind of somehow 8 pages at a time tricked myself into realizing that I could do a whole book. And then the publisher was like, you know, this is selling great for us, you have to keep doing it.
Well,
so that's I just say that because when people are talking about this giant thing, I just say like, give yourself like 4 pages, 6 pages, and you know it's something that like you can complete, and then you can feel a sense of accomplishment once you complete it, and that kind of gives you some momentum like to do the next thing.
yeah, that's my biggest thing when people ask me about writing. I mean, I got my start over at Boom just doing, I think I started with like a 2-pager. But if you can stick a landing in 2 pages, people will always talk about like, oh, I got like this magnum opus and it's gonna be good. Like, that sounds exhausting. Why would you do that to yourself, much less like any other team? And of course, like, they don't have anything done at the time, but like, man, if you can stick the landing on like a 2-pager, that's your truth, that's where you can really see your strengths. So
yeah, that's a great challenge. I mean, I think really the trick is if you can make somebody feel something in just 2 or 4 pages, like that's excellent training, because you don't want it to just be a download of information for anybody. You want them to like have in just 2 or 4 or 6 pages to like connect emotionally and personally to it in some way. And if you can do that in a small amount of pages, like then you know that you can do that with more.
yeah, eventually build up, but don't out of the gate. Here's a 210-page graphic novel. That sounds exhausting. I have to do that right now. I just have one of my I did backups for Radiant Black over an image, and then we collected that into a one-shot, and then we sold that to another publisher. And so now we have to actually do 210 pages. It's fine because we've done 4, almost 60 right now, so it's getting there. But like, yeah, when people hand you just can you take a look at my comic? I'm sure you get that all the time too. And I love when people do that because it's a few things. One, if they actually have something tangible, bring that. I'd love to flip through that, great. I don't care if it's a zine, ash can, whatever. It's something you can at least show to people. I had a guy like ask me if I can look at this comic. I'm like, yeah, sure. And then he hands me a pile of 14 by 17 Bristle pages. And like, wow, this isn't even fully inked or lettered or fully penciled. It's just kind of lightly done, except for like the first couple pages. And he's like, well, what do you think? And I was like, I think you need to go make a comic, my guy. Like, there's a Kinko's across the street. Just scan this, finish this, and just have at it. So, but it's kind of funny how you fell into A, being the writer artist, and B, also like having it already pretty much done.
So yeah, once I was doing Kabuki all through college, and they made a collection of it, and I attended a comic convention in Charlotte, North Carolina, Heroes Convention in 1995, and Joe Quesada was there, and he was, one of other creators that I had met for the first time and gave them my Kabuki collection.
You went to HeroesCon 95? Nice. My first show was at HeroesCon 94, so yeah, wow.
And so Joe Quesada called me back like the next week and said, hey, I really like your writing. I like this story. I'd like for us to collaborate together with Joe doing the art and me writing on something. And I was like, sure. And he, at the time, had a personal independent publisher called Event that he was publishing his creator-owned works from. And so he talked about that, like maybe it would be through that. But cut to, I eventually had to leave Caliber Comics and I started Kabuki at Image Comics and was writing and drawing it there. And I got a call from Joe Quesada. And based on my Kabuki story, I got the offer to start writing Daredevil in Marvel Comics. He said, don't tell anybody yet, but we're gonna take over like 4 comic titles at Marvel, Daredevil, Punisher, a couple other ones. And told me Kevin Smith was gonna start writing it, and he was gonna be doing the art, and asked me to write it. And then in the course of me writing the Daredevil series with Joe Quesada doing the art, he became the editor-in-chief of Marvel.
Funny how it works.
Wow, that was
yeah. Yeah, Joe Quesada is just an influential guy, but I think about Event Comics, because I think that was just him and Jimmy Palmiotti when they were putting out Ash. If anybody remembers Ash, the comic, it was about a super-powered, supernatural firefighter. I just remember. I think I still have my Kabuki foil card from Wizard from a million years ago. So,
before I get like too far down one road, does anyone have like any questions about anything else in particular? Like if it's about writing, drawing, comics, Christy.
I noticed you were wearing a shirt yesterday that said, but what I really want to do is direct. Oh!
So that shirt is it's from a Kubrick exhibit in Los Angeles that I it says Kubrick in the back. So it was a great exhibit and it was a cool shirt, so I got the shirt. But yeah, I've been directing like several music videos, as well as doing like opening titles for TV and film. I did some opening titles for some of Robert Rodriguez's TV shows and some other documentaries. And I really I've done some music videos for
Amanda Palmer.
Yeah, 3 of them for Amanda Palmer. One with Neil Gaiman for Pen America. And I did. Does anyone know the music group Dashboard Confessional?
Yeah.
I did their music video for a song called We Fight. You can see any of these like on YouTube for free. Just put in like David Mack music video or Dashboard or Amanda Palmer, and you can see any of these. And some of them are one of the Amanda Palmer videos I filmed in stop motion, and some other ones are animated. And I just started doing this thing where someone would ask me to do a music video and I didn't know how to do it, but I would just say yes. Amanda Palmer was like, hey, we need this music video, can you do it? I was like, yeah, of course. When do you need it? Oh, we need it in 2 weeks. Okay. And then I knew I didn't know how to do it when I said yes, but 2 weeks later I knew I would know how to do it when it was done. So I would just start saying yes to stuff that I didn't know how to do, and then figuring it out in the process, which is how I learned how to do comics. Like if
Yeah.
You want to learn how to do a comic, you have to make a comic, you know,
Yeah.
before you know how. And then also after you do that, I had this experience with Kabuki. Every issue, I thought I already knew how, but every issue I would feel like, oh man, look at these other published, like look at these, I used to know what I was doing, why do I not know how to do this one? So everyone has like a unique challenge that you still have to face and figure out. And there was like another music video with Amanda Palmer where it was that thing, you know, we need this in 2 weeks, and I did it all in like stop motion where I put like a tripod with a camera facing down here, and I had like a variety of
Move them around.
yeah, 3-dimensional things and like, you know, water and paint, and I would move them around and just click it and move it and click it. And you know, it turns out you can make a whole music video in 2 weeks by doing that. And the dashboard confessional one was interesting. I was on a flight from Japan to Singapore, which you kind of think they're in the same neighborhood, but it turns out it's a 7-hour flight. And next to me was like the guy sitting next to me was talking to me, and I noticed he put like his guitar case, you know, above. So he's like, hey, what do you do? And at the time, I didn't say comics, because at the time I was going to Singapore. I also traveled for the State Department, so I was going to Singapore for State Department work. And so I was like, oh, I'm doing this thing with the U.S. Embassy in Singapore. I was like, oh, I noticed you had you know, guitar case. You're a musician. He's like, yeah, we're in a band called Dashboard Confessional, and he was the lead singer named Chris Carrabba. And he's like, yeah, we had one of our songs in a Spider-Man movie.
Aww.
And so I was like, oh, cool. And he was telling me how much he loved comics, you know. And I hadn't told him I was in the comics or anything. And he was showing me stuff on his phone about, you know, all the stuff he was interested in. And I had been filming that Amanda Palmer stop motion things, some really cool photos on my phone, and so I started showing him that too. And we talked like the whole 7-hour flight. And at the end of the plane ride, we got to Singapore, and he said, hey, you know, you should direct our next music video. And I thought like, oh, you know, probably, I was like, oh yeah. I thought probably 2 years from now, I'll hear from him and we'll do something. You know, cut to the next week, I got an email from the record company and said like, I understand you're the director for this, and it's due in 30 days. So I just said, yeah, you know.
You got voluntold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You got told you had a job.
But yeah, and we can come back and cover some of this stuff, but speaking of like the State Department work, I did a lot of overseas travel for the US State Department, and then Ryan Bennis and I made a creator-owned comic book that was inspired by my overseas work for the State Department. It's called Cover, and we did a 6-issue series at DC Comics. It's collected, and we're currently working on a new series of it to come out through Dark Horse. But the reason I mention this is that we also sold it as a TV series to HBO Max, but we also did like a separate deal where Ryan did a deal for himself to write it, and I did a deal for myself to direct it. Because apparently, like all these music videos, all these opening titles and stuff was like, they liked the look of all that stuff. So it kind of all added up over time to, you know, give me the opportunity to, you know, to approach it that way too.
That's right, though.
So that's kind of been what we've been working on the last couple of years too. Although you probably heard there's like a lot of changes with HBO Max now and Discovery bought it, and there's all kinds of, there's definitely some, you know, some stuff afoot, you know, that we'll have to navigate.
Hopefully. So we, you know, get to see it eventually. I mean, they just did that Bruce Timm, the Crusader thing wasn't moving forward to HBO Max, but it's not canceled. They're just shopping it elsewhere. So that was the whole thing. Like a lot of things that are canceled are still being made. They're just going to go somewhere else. So hopefully at least finds a home.
Yeah.
So
Thank you, Christine.
I figured there was a story behind that.
Yeah.
yes.
Are you going to be doing any opening titles for the Echo show? Like,
I think I should. Yeah. I think that's a good idea. I hope Marvel is listening to this. The way it worked with Jessica Jones is I got an email from Joe Quesada that said urgent. And I was like, am I in trouble? You know, and so I looked at it and just said, call me. So
I love that urgent. That's worse than getting the message of calling.
Right. So I called
24
Joe.
hours to make a music video.
Yeah, something like that, right? Yeah, that was like the best case of what it was going to be, you know. So I called him. He's like, yeah, they're you know, they're trying to make the opening titles for Jessica Jones right now, and they keep hiring people to tell them to do it, to make it look like David Mack did it.
Oh my god.
And he said, you know, it's no one's doing it right. And so Joe Quesada said, I told them, why don't you just hire David Mack?
Why don't you just do it?
Yeah, why don't you
And they
just do
said,
that?
oh, can we do that? Yeah, so Joe put me in touch with Imaginary Forces was the team working on it. And so I went to the studios at Imaginary Forces, which by the way, like Imaginary Forces like have made like some incredible opening titles that I was already aware of, like the opening titles for like Seven from like 1995. And
That you also worked on.
well, I wrote
Yeah.
a story that goes into the Seven box set. I wrote a comic for it. But and Guillermo del Toro's early movie Mimic, they had some great opening titles they had done. So yeah, I went to the studios there and we worked on the Jessica Jones opening titles. So that happened that way because Joe was there, and we got we had for an Emmy on it. So I think they should ask me to do the titles for that. I should keep tweeting that.
Yes.
Might as well shoot a shot for something you've already done.
I know, so
Yes,
you
I
created.
did create the character.
Yeah. It's just always weird when people like give me a Blade style person. Like, why don't you just hire that person?
Yeah.
It reminds me of Ernie Hudson going to audition for a Real Ghostbusters animated show, and they're like, "Well, you're not Ernie Hudson enough," and he's like, "I'm Ernie Hudson," but he didn't get the gig because that voice gave it to Arsenio Hall. Arsenio Hall voices Winston in the Real Ghostbusters series.
He had that Ernie Hudson flavor.
He had the Ernie Hudson flavor, but yeah, but it's the same situation like the Transformers movies. Everyone kept auditioning, and then Peter Cullen walked up and did the voice. And Michael Bay's like, "Are you?" And he's like, "Yeah." And he's like, "All right, well, that's a wrap." and so it's so weird when people just want like, you know, David Mack light when they could just have, you know, David Mack. So,
I love doing like opening titles and.
do you have any favorites like that?
What of what I did? Or
No, just in general, because
my favorites are all the ones I did.
Oh, okay. That's fair. People don't know that's an Emmy thing because my buddy, his wife did the Mad Men credits, and she won an Emmy for that. So people don't realize like that's a really just important part. Like Westworld is always great. It's like never skip, can't skip credits. So,
But yeah, so I've heard that they just finished filming the Echo TV show. They filmed it here in Atlanta, and that it comes out next year.
yeah.
So yeah, hopefully between now and then there's some.
I mean, Blade's filming right now, and they're about to do Iron Hearts. They just get on those gigs while you're here.
I would like to do all that.
Yeah, some people were thinking there was a White Castle, like down, Seminole, down in Little Five. I'm like, oh, we're getting a White Castle. It's just for Ironheart. It doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's not a White Castle. No,
Thanks for
it's
mentioning.
it doesn't really exist.
Is this Harold
Did
and
anyone
Kumar
have
3?
anything else that?
I'm really curious, what do you do at the State Department exactly?
Most of the stuff they asked me to do.
I was gonna say, it's,
Yeah, most of it has been very positive.
But is it like art, or is it like,
Yeah, sometimes.
I mean, you're looking pretty jacked, I don't know if they have to do it.
he's like, yes, I do what they told me to
You can't talk
do.
about it, you're like, I can't talk.
So a lot of the stuff I've done with the State Department has been like public stuff. And every now and then they have something that they call non-branded, where they might be behind the scenes of an event that they don't want people to know that the embassy or State Department is involved with, often because they don't want someone who attends that event to face recrimination from.
I got it.
Well, I'll give you an example. I was involved in an event in Libya in 2017, and Libya is kind of, after Benghazi, where they overrun the embassy there, Libya is kind of like two warring militias that each think of themselves as the government, but they're each kind of extremist groups. And there was a Libya Comic-Con that was a grassroots Comic-Con that the Libyan comic fans started on their own. And the second year they were doing it, the embassy and the State Department, like we don't officially have like an embassy in Libya, but we kind of did have, but they operated from Tunis and Tunisia, right over the border. The State Department and the embassy would like help fund the people doing the Libya Comic-Con. But they don't want people to know that they did that, because if the militia groups didn't approve, like they would look at it as like an outside influence instead of a grassroots thing, the way it started. And if you could, I spoke at the Libya Comic-Con 2015, you could Google it. There was a, even though they had all the proper papers and stuff, and signed all the stuff, probably from one extremist group, the other extremist group came in with AK-47s and like arrested everybody at the Comic-Con.
What?
And this is gonna sound, this is kind of a bummer story. I mean, the good news is, as far as I know, nobody died. But a lot of people were like beaten and quickly released for attending the Comic-Con. And that's with them not even knowing the embassy or State Department was involved. But they did confiscate all of the laptops. And me and, when we were, we were being involved, there's sort of like a State Department version of Skype or Zoom. Yeah, I guess they didn't have Zoom back then, where it's, you have like 6 or 8 windows on there, and it's like, me, the people in Libya, the people in DC, and so on, and the people, the Libyan organizers who were organizing it. And so I have a lot of emails with the, so when they confiscated the laptops, I have to assume they see my emails somewhere in the laptop, or the other people's emails, and so on, right? So we didn't know how much they knew about, whatever, once they confiscated the laptops. But there were 6 main organizers that were, like, once people, the attendees, everyone has badges here. The extremists thought like someone with a badge was running the show, so they just started grabbing everyone with a badge, but everybody has a badge, right? So it took them a while to figure out who the organizers were. And they released everybody, but they kept the organizers. And I was getting like messages from, I was getting messages saying, oh, I'm the sister of, these guys, and talk to, and they're captured and they're being tortured, but they're also diabetic, and we're trying to go to the place where they're being held and giving them their medicine, but they won't let us in. And so like anytime I would get like, somebody would send me the full names, I would stop what I was doing and send to like the embassy, but also, I'm also involved in PEN America, so I would send it to PEN America also, and say, I have 6 names, and they'd be like, oh, we only have 4 names, and I would give like the full names and what their medical conditions were, because the U.S. Embassy couldn't do anything overtly, publicly, but I would also talk to the contacts in PEN America, and they could put some kind of influence on the UN to hopefully get them legal advocacy as well as their medication. So as far as I know, after 2 months, the organizers were released, but they were I think they were beaten and then not released until their wounds healed up, basically. As far as I know, nobody died. So there was like a 2 month period that was like a really weird period with that particular situation. But there were other times I was in North Africa, in Tunisia, and sometimes it would be organized, when I would travel for the State Department, it might be organized from different divisions of the State Department in DC, and they would organize with other embassies around the world, whatever that particular agenda was. In North Africa, it was under CVE, which is technically countering violent extremists. But in Tunisia, the agenda was, Tunisia is right on the border with Libya, Tunisia and Algeria. And those warring militias would be recruiting young people from the borders of the neighboring countries. So the agenda was to interact with at-risk youth and make them less susceptible to recruitment from extremist groups. So the embassy would drive me around in like a bulletproof SUV, and I would teach at like classes all along the borders, and just kind of show students like what's out there, try to inspire them, develop what they're, sort of the cultural, the winning hearts and minds, the cultural approach to things, just to make them inclined into a positive path and make them less susceptible, to be seduced by the negative.
that's awesome. I guess we want to read more, read cover.
Yeah, well said. But yeah, I was in Tunisia in 2017 and 2019, and you know, many different cities there, all kinds of different experiences there. You know, taught at all kinds of different schools. I taught at the School for the Deaf in Africa, Europe, and Asia. I taught at like youth prisons, refugee camps, UNHCR camps, IDP camps. So yeah, I got to, it opened up my world, quite a bit. I got to interact with a lot of different kinds of people.
Yeah.
I have two questions, but now I have a question because of that. How did you get into it all? Like, I know about you from the arts and stuff, but like, that's amazing.
Someone from Washington, D.C. in the State Department emailed me.
You and your emails.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, I have great stories about emails.
Urgent, State Department, call.
Yeah. So, like I said, a lot of this stuff is very public stuff, and a lot is like, showing the cultural influence of things, and sometimes it's just interacting with, minority groups and other countries on the borders for the U.S. to show that they're embracing, like for instance, the country of Georgia, former Soviet country. It's right next to Russia. It borders Armenia and Azerbaijan. It's near Iran and Turkey, so it's kind of right where Europe and Asia intersect, and has this strata of history and a lot of different ethnic groups there. But even back in like 2016, even like before we ever heard about Trump and Russian hacking and this kind of stuff, Russia was really waging a very anti-American, anti-Western propaganda campaign. And a lot of the older people in Georgia still got all their world news from Russia. So they would have me go to like all of the border areas. And depending on what border, I might be teaching at like an Azerbaijani school. And so I have an interpreter, who speaks Azeri there. Or even if it's technically in Georgia, it's where people speak Armenian, or it's where people speak Georgian, or it might be at a school for the deaf, and I have a sign language interpreter with me. But there were definitely they put me at a certain hotel that when I was in Georgia, all my laptop and my phone definitely worked different than they normally worked. And there was a time where like even everything, like Twitter, everything was working differently. So I knew something was going on. And I was emailing my State Department liaison, and they were all bouncing back, like from his .gov address. And so I contacted him a different way. I said, "Are you getting any of my emails?" And he's like, "Oh man, oh no, they're," I was like, "They're all bouncing back." He's like, "Oh man, the Russians just always fucking with their emails." So I was like, "Oh man, I gotta assume like the State Department's already reading all my email." But now like the Russians are reading it. and there was a moment where I was trying to call a car on my phone, and it just wasn't working the way it should be working. And so my friend was like, "Turn your Wi-Fi off, and then and see if it works that way." So I went to turn my Wi-Fi off, and I was on a Russian Wi-Fi signal that had a lock on it, right? To get on a locked signal, you need a password. And somehow I was on this, like, "Hey, try to get on this," and he couldn't get on it. I'm like, "Why am I on a locked Russian Wi-Fi?" And I was like, "Oh," and that would happen multiple times. I was like, "Oh man, like, why are the Russians, always in my phone?" And like I said, this is pre-Trump running for president or anything.
That's not the same phone, right?
The cool thing is I actually have there's like a collector of my artwork who works at Apple, and he sends me like brand new Apple phones and brand new like laptops and stuff. So like, fortunately, no, yeah. This is a new one. Yeah. Yeah, but every now and then there has been some very unique experiences, and some of them I was telling Bendis about some of them. Because we were actually working on a different creator-owned project that we were really excited about and working on and talking about for years. And I was telling him about the Libya thing and some other stuff. And at the time, it was like an intense situation, and he got the sense of my feeling about it. And he was like, "Hey man, that thing we're working on, let's do that some other time. The thing we're doing now, let's do it. What you just said to me, let's do that comic book right now." And I was very hesitant about that because I was imagining how I was having all these incredible experiences that I felt like, when I have a certain objectivity from it sometime in the future, it'll be nice to do sort of a memoir about it if I'm able to or something, but like a nonfiction approach. But he was like, "Oh, he was like, we'll change certain things," and I was like, "Well, I don't want anyone to feel like they're being made fun of or not taken seriously," but there was like in order to do it right, it had to be a certain tone. It would be really easy to not do it the right way. But I felt like we really pulled it off, where it has like the right level of levity and the right level of truth and mystery all integrated together in it. So if you haven't read this comic book series called Cover that Bendis and I worked on together, I highly recommend it. It was kind of my return to full interior art on a monthly series, which I hadn't done for a while. And there's a lot of personal stuff, in the story, and a lot of personal stuff left out of the story.
How does it feel to be a Russian asset?
No, I don't think that's the way the Russians viewed it at all. Yeah, I'll tell you something. The funny thing is, one of the main guys that I worked with for the State Department, he was stationed in Georgia. So I was in the country of Georgia in 2016, 2017, and 2019. And after that, he was moved to Moscow and stationed there. And so I was scheduled to be in Moscow in 2020, like right before the pandemic happened. So it happened, and I didn't go to Moscow at that time. And he was still stationed there for a while. But that guy actually just stayed at my place in LA like last week. I just saw him for the first time in a long time, and we were catching up on a few things about that. But there was a moment even where, when I was in the country of Georgia, they had me scheduled to do a lot of different interviews and stuff, radio, TV interviews, a variety of other stuff. And I was at this, they also had like this giant exhibit of my work at this, what they call the Art Palace there. And it was fascinating. There was like the politicians and the cutting of a ribbon. There was all kinds of, I experienced a lot of different levels of
Celebrity.
Well, that, but their usefulness of me happened in a lot of different ways. And so I was at this art exhibit, and it was packed. And I told him afterwards, like, "Hey, these two journalists, these women have come up, and one's from Uzbekistan and one's from Kyrgyzstan, and they insist that we have to do an interview with them, but they're not on the schedule or anything." He was like, "Oh yeah, they're not on the schedule, and I was like, "Okay, so I should just not do that, right?" He was like, "Oh, tell me what they said, I was like, "Well, they one said they were from this, and the other said this, and he's like, "Oh," and I was like, "But they are like really unusually attractive." So like, is that like? He was like, "Oh, it's like a honeypot." I was like, "Well, you don't know any like super secret dark secrets or anything. You should just like." I was like, "Okay, but I definitely don't go to dinner with them." He's like, "Oh, no, you definitely go." Yeah. He was like, "Yeah, just tell me what they ask you. Because if they ask you about Putin, which they will, just tell them you're here in an apolitical context and you can't, you don't discuss anything politically." And then they asked me about Putin, I said that. And then I started having like this double life that week of like, in the daytime, I would be teaching at all these different schools, different cities, and then at night, like these other people were showing me like the nightlife of the whole city, and I was, keeping him updated about what was going on. And it was there were a lot of fascinating experiences, a lot of stuff I'm leaving out.
Imagine. Time check real quick. We got like 10 minutes. Any other questions? In the back.
Just curious, I'm sorry for asking this, but how did the collaboration come about on the Fight Club?
Oh, cool. Yeah. So, if anyone's not aware, Chuck Palahniuk did a sequel to Fight Club called Fight Club 2, and then eventually Fight Club 3. and he decided that he had already done Fight Club as a book, and it had also been a film. He wanted to try something brand new to challenge himself, so he did it as a graphic novel, as a comic book series, which he hadn't written in that format before. And this was, I think, maybe 2012 or 2013 when we started working on it. But I had written Chuck Palahniuk a letter maybe in 2006, and he wrote back to me and said, hey, he lived in Portland. He said, next time you're in Portland, come meet up with me. So every time I was in Portland, which is where Bendis lives, I would meet up with Chuck and have like dinner or lunch with him as far back as 2006. And I would tell him about how I'm working in comics. He told me what he was working on, and we kind of had this meeting situation. We would just keep doing. In fact, I would be staying at Bendis' house, and I'd be like, "Okay, Brian, I gotta leave now. I gotta go to my dinner with Chuck Palahniuk." And he thought like Chuck Palahniuk was like my Tyler Durden, like I wasn't really meeting anybody. Like he would walk by the restaurant and see me at the table talking to myself. Because I kept like he was never seeing Chuck there. And I just kept telling him I was meeting him all the time over there. But cut to, he decides to do it, and they asked me to do the covers for Fight Club. I'm guessing probably based on my pre-existing relationship with Chuck.
Yeah. You do covers for lots of things though.
Lots of covers. Well, a lot of me doing covers was because of my traveling for the State Department. Because like when you're doing like a monthly series, especially if you're doing the interior artwork or if you're writing and drawing a book, it can be like a very immersive experience. And this book has to fit with this book, and you have to have a big, broad picture of it. And I was traveling overseas much of the year. I was overseas for many years, so for me, I was able to still kind of stay in comics by just doing covers and stuff. It was fun. It was kind of like I might be in one city one night, another city another night or something, and I do my regular work in the day, and I'm painting a comic book cover at night, and then I would just like, even if I don't have a scanner, it's like a little trick of it. Like this iPhone photo is like, the camera is so good, I will take a photo of the art and you can print from the photo. I've printed many covers that way. And that was a way for me to, like, I was able to do covers I kind of like the idea of a cover because it's, it's just this one single image crystallized, and then you move on to a totally other problem to solve with the next cover, Whereas when you're doing like a whole series, you're really immersed in it, and there's like a lot of time pressure, issue to issue, page to page.
Two more questions, I think. Yes.
Yeah, first I wanted to say thanks for calling out the newbie mistake of making a magnum opus and being a masochist.
Yeah.
Would you say that when people who eventually do assemble their own saga, especially if it's someone who is just breaking into comics, to do chapters as short stories that can just be resolved on their own, and then just by serendipity, the serendipity assembles?
Definitely, and I'm not saying don't do a magnum opus. Like for instance, Kabuki has just been collected by Dark Horse into 4 omnibus volumes. Mm-hmm. Each one's 416 pages. Mm-hmm. So that's like 1,600 pages of, it's really the foundation of my work in comics is Kabuki, which, in comics is probably my magnum opus, right? Mm-hmm. But, doing them 8 pages at a time and then like 1 issue at a time and like 1 series at a time is a way for me to get like my head around it, for it to seem possible. But I think also like when you give yourself a small enough, you get to pour everything into like that facet of the story, and then while I'll be working on 1 chapter of Kabuki or 1 limited series, I know what the theme of that story is, but in the process of doing it, then I'm thinking about, where does it go next? But I don't have to have it all worked out ahead of time, which is also something I would advise to people. Don't feel like you have to have everything figured out ahead of time before you start, because you'll just never start, because you'll never get it figured out, Like the only way you figure it out is by being in the process of it, and kind of dancing with it, and then the story kind of reveals itself to you, like what it wants to be when you're making the effort,
Yeah, writing is rewriting. Like that's especially like the comic process.
And for me, a lot of it is simplifying to a degree. I have like a lot of information I think is going to go in there, and at a certain point you realize there's a certain amount of information that's just distracting and that you don't need in there. And when we were co-writing for Daredevil End of Days with Bill Sienkiewicz and Klaus Janson too, we would write a full script and they would do the art, but once we saw their art, we would realize like, hey, let's trim half of this dialogue. We don't need any more because the body language and the facial expressions and the magic of what they've drawn is communicating so much. And I had that experience too when I was doing Kabuki. I would write so much in the script, but I was lettering it myself too. So when it came time to letter it, I'd be like, oh, there's like so many words on this page. Every time I was lettering it, I cut 50% of the dialogue I intended to be on there. I definitely cut, you know?
Yeah, especially when you're collaborating with someone, it's easier to rewrite than it is to redraw. So when I get pages back, it might be different. The art's duty is to elevate the story, and if it's properly elevated, you're just like, oh well, this doesn't work what I had, but it's easier to do my job than it is reading yours, and so I'll rewrite dialogue. Dialogue's never finished until it's like done, probably lettered, and then maybe you can change after that.
Did you have a question too?
Yeah, when you were creating Echo, were you like, how did nobody ever think of the opposite of Matt Murdock? The blind and deaf and enablement, that thing?
Kevin Smith gave me some like advice about Daredevil, which I'm not going to use his exact words because it was inappropriate.
I'm so surprised.
He was talking about the different love interests of Daredevil, and it got me to thinking that Matt Murdock and Daredevil had a record of love interests that I felt like he each connected to one of them in a certain way, but there were a lot of ways that they didn't connect. Like he connects to Elektra in a certain way, but he connects to Karen Page in a different way. But all of them, they're still like he still lives in a different world than they do. He still perceives the world in a totally different way than they do. So there's still kind of a disconnect with him, even like trying to connect with his love interest. And I thought, how interesting it would be for him to go on a date with a woman who also perceives the world in such a dramatically different way than other people, but also very different from him. But they're both used to being, they're both set apart by how the rest of the world perceives things different than they do. So they have that in common, but they're also kind of like almost exactly missing each other at the same time, So I thought, what an interesting thing to explore. And sometimes like writing stuff is just putting like two characters with strong points of view in the same room. Like you don't have to create like somebody who's right and someone who's wrong or good or bad. You just have to create a character that has a strong point of view and another character that has a strong point of view, and then you put them next to each other. And like with Kabuki, I would do that sometimes too. Like one character thinks of the world through the lens of science, another character thinks of the world through the lens of art, or art as activism, or someone else thinks of the world through the lens of spirituality, and you put them in the same room together, and everything they kind of say or perceive is through their own lens, And so I thought, well, what a bold experiment to do with, and it became Echo and Daredevil, and they go on a date together, and there's some stuff that's very charming about it, but there's some stuff that like they're not quite speaking the same language at the same time too.
That's a really good question. We got one more.
I have one that might be super fast. The airplane.
2 minutes.
The airplane meeting of the guy you were just talking about from Dashboard Confessional. Did that happen before or after?
No, that was later.
Alchemy.
Yeah.
So it was
later.
synchronistic.
Yeah. No, a lot of stuff
You didn't
I
write
write in my
Alchemy
books,
based on
and
that.
then it becomes real after.
Woohoo!
Yeah, I found
That
I
was
experienced that a
very-
lot. Yeah.
So you're like predicting your life
Yes.
in your
Yeah.
art.
Did you realize it while you were sitting there?
It crossed my mind.
Yeah.
So I have a completely different kind of question about, in your art, you tend to combine like the strong, but I feel like the strong graphic arts thing of like very solid lines and very daring shapes, and then you throw watercolors on it, and I think a watercolor is kind of the antithesis of that. It goes where the water wants it to go, where the media wants it to go. Is there any deliberate balance you try to make to those? Are there any pieces you did where you did like one thing and just the watercolors didn't feel right, so you just kind of started over?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times, like if it's like a cover or something, a lot of times it's just kind of problem solving. But sometimes, like thematically in a story, like when I started Kabuki, the whole first series is in black and white. It's kind of like a stark, high contrast black and white. And you know, I was in oil painting classes, and you know, I was doing that when I was in college. You know, I knew how to paint and use color, but I thought, how interesting to learn how to tell the story in black and white instead of doing, at the time I was doing very like collage, mixed media stuff in college, but I thought, this story felt like it needed to be a black and white, the first story for Kabuki, it felt like it needed to be a black and white story. And I felt like, for certain reasons of the story, like certain parts of it dealt with different time periods, and I felt like black and white immediately abstracts reality, but it also gives you the sense that it feels like a documentary, or it feels realistic, or it feels like a old photograph that immediately transports you to a different time, but at the same time feels timeless. You know, certain films have used that to good effect, say like Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, or Spielberg's Schindler's List, or Scorsese's Raging Bull, or David Lynch's The Elephant Man. All of those films, it immediately abstracts the reality, but it puts you in a specific time immediately, but also has a sense of like universality and timelessness at the same time. And I thought, that's what that first story needs to do. Even though I'm naturally comfortable at doing the color, I'm gonna learn to do black and white for that story, but at the same time I knew that at a certain culmination of that story, when something changes for the character and the story arc, I know that in my toolbox, I have all this color technique that I'm gonna pull out at a certain point that, you know, people aren't gonna expect that. But when something changes with the character, then I'm gonna change the style, but I'm also gonna change the medium and, you know, and bring the color in at that time. So like sometimes, like thematically, I think that way in broader strokes, you know, ahead of time. But sometimes there's just a certain amount of balance that I'm looking for with a cover. With like, sometimes I'm looking for like really, one of the secrets for me with approaching covers, for instance, is because like the cover, you know, the main job of a cover is to get people's attention, right? If you're in a comic book store, it's to make them walk up to the cover and pick it up. Or if you're seeing a cover online, it's to make them click on it. And the way I realized you have to do that is not think of the cover just on its own. You have to realize the cover in its natural habitat is with 100 other covers. So you have to do something to differentiate yourself from that shelf of 1,000 other comic books that are all fighting for your attention. And one way I do that is I try to start with really bold shapes that you're gonna see the shape of it from a distance, or if it's really small, and like a thumbnail on your computer screen. And I also do what I call like a buffer zone, where I make the edges might be white or one solid color or something, so it almost makes like a frame unconsciously that separates it from the books that are next to it. And so often I'll start very graphically, with my graphic design background, I'll start with really bold shapes, but then I'll kind of encrypt that into, you know, more subtle nuances of color theory at the same time.
Great answer. Hey, before we wrap up, where can we find you, David?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. I am at my table for like the last 30 minutes of the show. Right? Yeah, A17, just right over there, next to where Brian Bendis used to be on that wall, right over there. And you are welcome to come to my table. If you have any other questions that we didn't cover, or any other ideas that you thought about in here, feel welcome to bring it up at my table. I have art, prints, books, anything you're welcome.
Yeah.
Well, thank
Every
you
year.
for stopping by, everyone.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's super delight. Thank you.
I try to be the light.
You did a great job. Thanks.
Oh, no slow clap, no slow claps, no slow claps, no slow claps, no slow claps. Oh, awkward.
I'll be by your table.